Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our current session is about recapitulating some methods. This is part 2 of recapitulation of methods. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to have a review of the following methods. Number 1, multiple intelligence. Number 2, neuro-linguistic programming. Number 3, the lexical approach. Number 4, competency-based language teaching. Number 5, communicative language teaching. Number 6, the natural approach. Number 7, cooperative language learning. Number 8, content-based instruction. And number 9, task-based language teaching. So in total, we would review 9 methods in this session. Well, my dear students, when it comes to the first method, that is multiple intelligences, it is based on a learner-based philosophy, and it characterizes human intelligence as having multiple dimensions that must be acknowledged when it comes to education or language learning. Well, it was proposed by Gardner in 1993, and basically his view was that the traditional IQ tests measure only logic and language, yet there are so many other dimensions of human intelligence which are of equal importance and which need to be measured. Learners in this method are viewed as possessing individual learning styles, preferences, and intelligences. The method focuses on certain objectives. There are no goals stated for multiple intelligences instructions in terms of linguistic terms, but it focuses on the optimal utilization of multiple intelligences of the learners. Multiple intelligences pedagogy focuses on the language class as the setting for a series of educational support systems aimed at making the language learner a better designer of his or her own learning experiences or learning style. When it comes to the syllabus, again, there is no fixed or rigid syllabus in multiple intelligences method. It is dependent upon the learner and the nature or the type or the style of the learning of the learner that the syllabus would be designed. As far as the role of learners is concerned, they are typically expected to take an multiple intelligences inventory and to develop their own MI profiles based on the inventory, which would help them kind of identify, or which would help them kind of discover what kind of intelligences they have as prominent ones or as dominant ones. When it comes to the role of the learners, they are expected to reflect. And it is thought that the more awareness students have of their own intelligences and how they work, the more they will know how to use that intelligence to access the necessary information and knowledge from a lesson. Well, like multiple intelligences method, which was a very, very different perspective on learning and which did not focus on a traditional view of intelligence, which would rather consider, for example, somebody's ability to use logic or somebody's ability to create a rhythm as to different kinds of intelligences. Neuro-linguistic programming was another way of language learning and teaching, which had its basis as something very different. It refers to a training philosophy and set of training techniques first developed by John Grindler and Richard Bandler in the mid-1970s as an alternative form of therapy. They were essentially interested in discovering how successful communicators achieved their success. They believed that there are people who can successfully communicate, so they were interested in finding out how these people use various skills for that. They developed NLP, that is neuro-linguistic programming, as a system of techniques therapists could use in building rapport with their clients. So again, this method has some basis in psychology. It is based on a series of underlying assumptions about how the mind works and how people act and how do they interact. NLP claims that knowing precisely what you want helps you achieve it. This principle can be expressed as know what you want. So know what you want is the basic principle behind NLP. As far as the role of teachers and learners in NLP is concerned, well, teachers are expected to model their teaching on expert teachers they most admire. So, the teachers would follow the teachers that they admire. the learners are expected to find successful models of learning for that person they themselves are striving to become. So, be it the learner or the teacher, each of them has to set an ideal, aspire to be like somebody, and then they would work towards that. So according to this method, to be an excellent teacher, what is required is model excellent teachers, look at that they do, act, how they act, what sort of relationship do they have with their learners or colleagues or students, ask then how they feel about what they do and what are their beliefs. So, idealizing a teacher is important for a teacher, and then to follow in the footsteps of that idealized teacher and to follow the patterns of teaching, learning, and of behavior that that teacher uses is important for a teacher in NLP. NLP as per se is not a language teaching method. It does not consist of a set of techniques for teaching a language based on theories and assumptions at the levels of an approach and as a design. However, it provides certain kind of guidelines as in a way for the behavior or attitude towards teaching and learning. Central to an approach or method in the language teaching is a view of the nature of the language, which shapes teaching goals, the type of syllabus that is adopted, and the emphasis that is given in the classroom teaching. With this, my dear students, we come to the third method of the session for review, that is lexical approach, that is derived from the belief that the building blocks of language learning and communication are not grammar or the functions of grammar, rather it is the lexis, that is the vocabulary. Lexical approach reflects a belief in the centrality of lexicon to language structure, second language learning, and language use, and in particular to multi-word lexical units, that is we call chunks, pieces of language or chunks. These have been referred to by many different labels, for example, hollow phrases, prefabricated patterns, gambits, speech formulae, or lexicalized stems. Basically, these are the chunks that are used as they are. A number of lexically based text and computer resources have become available to assist this kind of learning of lexicon. As far as the objectives of lexical approach are concerned, Willis 1990s describes the rationale and the design of this kind of teaching, and Collins' Cobbled English course shows its application. Both of these combined can set the principles for the use of this method. When it comes to the role of the teacher as compared to the other methods that we have talked about, the role of the teacher is of a major source of learner input in demonstration how lexical phrases are used in different functional contexts for different functional purposes. So the teacher is the major source of giving the input. As far as the role of the learner is concerned, they make use of computers to analyze text data previously collected or made available free form on the internet. So the role of learners mainly is of data analysts. They analyzed all the data that is gathered through different sources that is available on net, and by analyzing that, they learn what is right, what is wrong, how it is to be used. So in terms of the role of the learner, that is of an analyst, it is completely different from the previous methods that we have discussed. With this, we come to the fourth method, that is competency-based language teaching method, which is called TBLT as well. This is an educational movement that focuses on the outcomes or outputs of learning in the development of language programs. So competency-based language teaching is different from all the methods that were previously proposed. It emerged in the United States in 1970s and refers to an educational movement that advocates defining educational goals in terms of precise, measurable descriptions of the knowledge, skills, and behaviors. Basically, competency-based language teaching is the application of the principles of competency-based education. So competency-based education is a broader concept, and within this competency-based education, competency-based language teaching is one component. We may define it like that. It was widely adopted by the end of the 1970s and particularly was used as the basis for the design of work-related and survival-oriented language teaching programs. When we say survival-oriented programs, so, for example, when people would go to a new place, when as immigrants, they would go somewhere and settle there, to help them survive in the new context, or to help them survive in the new socio-cultural setting, this is one of the basic methods that was used, that is to enable them to develop certain competencies that would help them survive. CBLT is a framework for language teaching in situations where learners have specific needs. Of course, in a particular environment, in a particular job, in a particular socio-cultural context, whatsoever are their needs. As far as the syllabus is concerned, they are developed around the subjects, and objectives may also be specified, but these usually have little role in the teaching or assessing of the subject. So, they would be taught a subject, but language would be taught through that process. A student receives a set of marks for his or her performance relative to other students, from which it is very difficult to make any form of judgment about the specific knowledge or skills of a student that he or she has acquired. Now, when it comes to the weaknesses and strengths of any particular method, this CBLT has this weakness, that it has kind of what I would say relative marking. So if there is a group of 30 students, each student would be graded in comparison with the other 29 students. So if the whole group is good, for example, the performance of the 29th number student would be relatively very poor as compared to the other students, but in comparison to other students of other groups, his or her performance may be far better. So this is one of the weaknesses. So any two students, in other words, who receive the same marks in a test, but in fact they have widely different capacities and knowledge in the subject, this becomes a challenge in this particular method. As far as the learning activities that are used in this method are concerned, they consist of competencies that are based on a description of the essential skills, knowledge, attitude, and behaviors that are required for a real world task or activity. Well, the next method that we are going to review is communicative language teaching method. I hope and expect that you are very much familiar with this method. This is one of the most popular methods that are being used currently. This is centered around, the pedagogy that has been shaped through a quarter of the last century. However, by the late 1960s and 1970s, researchers became skeptical about its effectiveness. So, for example, Newmark argues, and he adopted the view that complex bits of language are learned as a whole chunk at a time rather than learned as an assemblage of constituent items in this. In 1971, the Council of Europe, a wing of EEC, commissioned a group of European applied linguists and entrusted them with the task of designing a new way to teach foreign languages. Now, communicative language teaching method, based on the learning that had taken place through all the methods that had developed through the times, now this group of people, they started thinking about something that would help them overcome all the shortcomings of all the previous methods. So a work that was originally published as a monograph in 1972, which was revised and expanded in 1976 and was titled as National Syllabuses, this was the beginning of communicative method. Instead of merely a grammatical core, the new syllabus consisted of categories of notions such as time, sequence, quantity, location, and frequency, and categories of communicative functions, for example, informing, requesting, instructing, etc. Now, the National Functional Syllabus, as it was known, provided a new way of exploiting the situational dialogue inherited from the past by indicating that formal and functional properties can, after all, be gainfully integrated. So this thus began a language teaching movement which later became well known as communicative method or communicative approach or simply communicative language teaching. These are various terms that are used interchangeably. And the watchword here is, of course, the word communication, which brings them all together on the same platform. When it comes to the criticism on communicative language teaching, in spite of the trendy jargon that is used in textbooks and the journals of the teachers, the actual problem was that it lacked, the real output. So the learners, despite all the trendy teaching jargons that the teacher would talk about and would claim to use in the class, the learners would not be able to communicate in the real life situations. And one of the major drawbacks was the lack of theory behind this. The next method, my dear students, that we're going to review is the natural approach, which was presented in 1977 by Tracy Terrell, who was a teacher of Spanish in California. Well, Terrell outlined a proposal for a new philosophy of language teaching, which he called the natural approach. He joined forces with Stephen Krashen, an applied linguist at the University of Southern California, in elaborating or in presenting a theoretical rationale for this approach. Drawing on Krashen's influential theory of second language acquisition, it was in 1983, both of them worked combinedly together. They presented a statement of the principles and practices for this method. The fact that the authors of the natural approach relate their approach to the natural method has led some people to assume that natural approach and natural method are synonymous. We need to understand that these are two completely different things. Although the tradition is a common one, there are important differences between the natural approach and the natural method. That is the older version, I would say, which it will be useful to consider at the outset when we want to understand the natural approach. The natural method is another term for what in 1900s had become known as the direct method, whereas the natural approach is something different. In its extreme form, the natural method consisted of a series of monologues by the teacher interspersed with exchanges of questions and answers between the instructor and the learner. Whereas when we compare with this natural method, the natural approach has an emphasis on exposure or input rather than the practice. So, the natural method, that is another name for the direct method, is based on the drill of, language, whereas the natural approach is the natural way of learning language, which focuses more on the exposure to language in a natural way or input in a natural way. Optimization of emotional preparedness for learning is central to the natural approach. A prolonged period of attention to what the language learners hear before they try to produce a language. First, there is a need to create a kind of willingness in them to use a language, and then they would be later on, when they are ready to produce language, only then they would produce language. As far as the objectives of natural approach are concerned, it is for beginners. It is for younger children to help them learn a language, and it is designed to help them become intermediate level learners. So, for example, after 100 or 150 hours of natural approach Spanish, you will be able to get around in Spanish. You would be able to speak basic Spanish, and you would be able to interact with the native speakers. As far as the type of learning and teaching activities are concerned, according to this method, the emphasis is on presenting comprehensible input in the target language. And from where does this input come? It comes from the teacher, from the teacher talk. The teacher focuses on objects in the classroom and on the content of the pictures. This is where there is a similarity with the direct method, by the way. In order to minimize the stress, learners are not required to say until and unless they are completely ready to say. So they are given the opportunities to take input, and only when they are willing to speak, they would speak. The teacher talks slowly and distinctly, asking questions and eliciting one-word answers so that the learners become comfortable. Various techniques are recommended by Krashen and Terrell that are borrowed from other methods. This is an important aspect of this method, that various techniques are borrowed from other methods and are incorporated in this method, which include, for example, command-based activities which are taken from total physical response, direct method activities such as the use of gestures, question answers, etc., situation-based practices of structures and patterns. And also there are group work activities which are often identical to those that are used in communicative language method. So various methods, various techniques, various kind of activities are borrowed from multiple methods and they are incorporated. With this we come to the 7th method, that is cooperative language learning, which is also called CLL, that is a part of more general instruction approach known as collaborative learning or CL. So CL or collaborative learning is something bigger, a whole, of which a part is cooperative language learning or CLL. Well, CLL makes maximum use of cooperative activities that involve pair work and small groups of learners in the classroom. The early 20th century US educator John Dewey is usually credited with the promotion of this method to be used in the classroom. It was more generally promoted and developed in the United States in the 1960s and 70s as a response to the forced integration of public school and has been substantially refined and developed since then. So out of the practical needs of the times, actually I would say it emerged. As far as the theory of learning behind cooperative learning is concerned, they advocate to draw heavily on the theoretical work of developmental psychologists such as Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, and both of whom stress the central role of social interaction in learning. Now the key word here is social interaction. As far as the syllabus of CLL is concerned, it does not assume any particular form of language syllabus. There are various kind of activities which are used, a variety of activities in the curriculum that can be taught through cooperative learning. And again, I would say the key word is cooperative learning. So collaboratively, cooperatively, any activities that can be used for learning, they would come under CLL. With this we come to the 8th method and its review, that is content-based instruction, which draws for its principles on communicative language teaching that emerged in 1980s. Now, important aspect of this method is that content-based instruction draws mainly upon communicative language teaching. An ideal situation for language learning, second language learning, I would say, is where the subject matter of language teaching was not grammar or functions or some other language-based units, but content, that is the subject matter from outside the domain of language. Now, so for example, to teach history, or for example, to teach geography, or for example, to teach psychology, or to teach any other subject. So mainly that subject would be taught, but language would be used as a tool to teach that, and in the process of teaching the contents of that, this language, foreign language, would also be taught. There are various kinds of programs for students with limited English proficiency. For example, SLEP programs are very, very popular in this regard. We also have LSP, that is language for specific purposes, which again is kind of creating programs for students who want to be engineers or technicians or nurses or doctors. So they would be taught the contents of their relevant field or profession, but in that process actually the language would be taught. And any of these who need to acquire content and real world skills through the medium of a second language rather than to master the language for its own sake. So mastering the language for its own sake, or to master the contents with the help of that foreign language, these are two different things, and these are two different perspectives which make this particular method different from all the previous methods. Its objectives include a typical CBI course as for the achievement of content objectives, that is sufficient evidence for learning a language through the contents which are based on the specialized needs of the learner. Learner's role is to become autonomous so that they can come to understand their own learning process and they can take charge of their own learning. They are interpreters of the input. They are willing to tolerate the uncertainty as they are going through the process of learning, and they are willing to seek multiple interpretations of the oral and of the written texts. As far as the role of the teachers is concerned, the CBI anticipates a change in the typical role of the teachers. Instructors must be more than just good language teachers. They must be knowledgeable in the subject matter that is to be taught as well. This brings us to the last method that we would review in this session, that is task-based language teaching. This approach was proposed by Willis in 1996, and it is based on the use of tasks as the core unit of planning and instruction of a language teaching course. Two early applications of a task-based approach within a communicative framework for language teaching were the Malaysian Communicational Syllabus that was introduced in 1975 and the Bangalore project that was introduced in 1987. TBLT proposes the notion of task. Task becomes the central focus. Definitions of task vary, but there is a commonsensical understanding that a task is an activity or a goal that is carried out using language in various ways, such as finding out a solution to a puzzle, reading a map, giving directions, making a telephone call, for example, for a reservation in hotel, writing a letter, reading a set of instructions, or assembling a toy, etc. So there can be a huge variety in the tasks. As far as the objectives of this task-based language learning is concerned, there are few published or perhaps fully implemented examples of complete language programs that claim to become fully based on this recent formulations of TBLT. The literature contains mainly descriptions of examples of task-based activities which any communicative language teaching methods user or teacher can apply in his or her class. I hope and expect this review of various methods during the session would have given you a clarity on the similarities and differences of these methods.